Bienvenue à tous pour ce 12e Rendez-vous du Futur, un rendez-vous très spécial puisqu'il n'est pas en direct, il n'a pas lieu au Cube à Issy-les-Moulineaux où nous faisons nos Rendez-vous du Futur depuis 1 an et demi déjà. C'est une émission plus courte que d'habitude que nous vous proposons, une émission qui a été tournée par l'équipe de la Gilet Carré dans un hôtel à Paris le 6 février dernier, mais c'est une émission qui reste interactive puisque vous avez été très nombreux à poser des questions sur Facebook, Twitter et le site rendez-vous-du-futur.com. La personnalité que nous recevons aujourd'hui est un des acteurs essentiels de la pensée de notre époque. Auteur d'une vingtaine de best-sellers, traduits dans plus de 35 langues, Jérémy Rifkin est ce que l'on appelle une personnalité influente. Il conseille des chefs d'État, des chefs de gouvernement, la Commission européenne. Le magazine politique américain National Journal l'a classé parmi les 150 personnalités les plus influentes de notre époque concernant la politique américaine. Il a écrit un nouvel ouvrage, La troisième révolution industrielle, aux éditions Les Liens qui libèrent. C'est une véritable analyse, une analyse colossale même, prédictive, d'une nouvelle ère qui s'annonce. Il nous présente des pistes et des pionniers pour nous orienter vers un nouvel horizon. Cet entretien est réalisé en anglais. Merci à Triple C, Sylvain et Amélie pour la traduction et les sous-titrages. Merci à la Gilet Carré pour la réalisation. Cette rencontre a été préparée par Nils Aziosmanoff, président du Cube, et Salomé Kiner, responsable éditorial de la librairie en ligne nabu.com. Je vous dis à tout à l'heure.
Jeremy Rifkin, The Third Industrial Revolution is your 5th book in 10 years, where you have developed the idea that the world is doomed if we don't change our entire system of values. So power, systemic problems, culture, what is holding back these changes?
I think what's holding it back is the human imagination. What we have is an older generation that thinks 20th century and a younger generation that thinks 21st century, and therein lies the nub of the problem. We need to see a shift, a generational shift. We have a crisis. It's an economic crisis, it's a civilization crisis, and ultimately it's a crisis of our species. We are facing the prospect of our own potential extinction on this planet. Unless people think that is over the top, let me remind folks that 99.5% of all the species of life that ever existed on this planet are gone, extinct. Why do we think we're going to be the 1/2 of 1% that's going to survive? And let me share a statistic with you. The primary economy of the Earth is photosynthesis. Everything depends on it. We human beings are 7 billion in numbers now, a lot of us. But we only make up 1/2 of 1% of the living biomass of the world. On the other hand, today we're using 30% of all the photosynthesis of this Earth, and we're going to 9 billion people. It's unsustainable. We now have 2 crises. We have peaked on the second industrial revolution, and that happened in 2008 when oil hit $147 a barrel. When that happened, all the prices for everything else went up because everything in this society is made out of or moved by fossil fuels. Our pesticides and fertilizers, our construction materials, our pharmaceutical products, our synthetic fiber, they're all made out of fossil fuels. Our power, our transport, our heat and light, it's all moved by fossil fuels. So when oil goes over 130, 140 a barrel, all the other prices go up. And in July 2008, the prices for everything in the supply chain were so expensive, we all stopped buying. And the global economy shut down that month. Shut down. That was the economic earthquake. The collapse of the financial markets 60 days later, that was the aftershock. And the reason this is happening is we've hit 2 milestones. We've now hit peak oil per capita, and we've now hit peak oil production, meaning that if we distributed all the oil today, there's less to go around than there was 30 years ago. And now half the oil is used up. So we're now maturing these energies, and they're getting more expensive. In addition, China and India have now brought in 1/3 of the human race into the second industrial revolution in its last stages. So the aggregate demand against the supply of energy is so great, with India and China and the developing world now in the game, that every time we try to regrow the economy, At the same rate we were growing before 2008, oil prices go up, all the other prices on the supply chain go up, purchasing power shuts down. So this is an end game. We have reached peak globalization for the second industrial revolution. We're going to see 4 to 6 year cycles of regrowth, collapse, regrowth, collapse. For example, in 2009, oil was only 30 a barrel. It went from 147 to 30 because there was nothing going on. The economy was stalled. As soon as we started to replenish inventories in 2010, oil prices shot up. They're 114 a barrel this afternoon. All the other prices are going up. Purchasing power is shutting down again. So these cycles of 4 to 6 years are going to be very wild. And we can't get out of this wall of 150 a barrel. So we're in an end game for the second industrial revolution. That's compounded now by industrial-induced climate change. We're now paying the entropy bill for the first and second industrial revolution. We have spewed so much CO2 into the atmosphere for the first and second industrial revolution, and methane, and nitrous oxide. We can't get enough of the sun's heat off this planet. It's much worse than we suspect. Our scientists in the UN panel on climate change say we're probably going to go up 3 degrees Celsius by the end of this century, your kids. Now that's looking optimistic. That report was 4 years ago. But if we only go up 3 degrees, that takes us back to the temperature on Earth 3 million years ago in the Pliocene, completely different world. And what I would like all the folks listening to this to know is this is all about the shift in the water cycle. What's so terrifying about climate change is it shifts the entire hydrological cycle of the planet. We're the watery planet. All of life depends on water. Most of our bodies are made out of water. For every 1 degree that the temperature on Earth rises, the atmosphere absorbs 7% more precipitation from the ground. It sucks it up. That means the whole water cycle is destabilized. More floods, more droughts, more extreme winters, more extreme summers, more hurricanes, more tsunamis, more wildfires. That's what's going on. So our ecosystems can't catch up fast enough to the shift in the water cycle, and they destabilize. Then all the species of life in those ecosystems die out. Our scientists tell us that we are in the early stages of the sixth great extinction event in the last 450 million years. We've had 5 mass extinctions in the last 500 million years in the geological record. And when extinctions happen, they happen quickly. The whole chemistry of the planet shifts. Every time there's been a mass extinction, it's taken 10 million years to recover the biodiversity we lost. So our scientists say we're in the early stages now in this century of the 6th major extinction event, and we could lose up to 70% of the plant and animal species to climate change. That's a wipeout. As my wife says, we are sleepwalking. There is no fail-safe that we will stay as a species on this planet. We're at a decisive moment for you, your children, and your grandchildren. So what we need to do now is step back and ask the question, where do we go from here? We need a new economic vision that's compelling, a new economic game plan that's practical, and we have to deliver a post-carbon society in the developing world in 30 years.
Okay, so talking about solution, the new computer technologies make possible the production, the stocking, and the sharing of energies. What is the infrastructure needed for the smart grid?
Well, this is interesting because all the great economic revolutions in history occur when new energy regimes emerge. They make possible more complex living environments. But then they require communication revolutions to manage the increased complexities of the new energy. So historically, it's when communication and energy revolutions converge and merge, they create new infrastructures that change the economic paradigm. They change consciousness. They change the way we think of society and our planet we live in. For example, in the 19th century, print technology became very cheap. We went from manual printing to steam power presses. So we could produce lots of print very cheaply, very quickly. But then we needed people to read the print. So France actually created the prototype of the public school system for the rest of the world. French did it. And in the 19th century, we introduced public schools, and we created a print-literate workforce with the communication skills to manage a complex coal and steam-powered first industrial revolution. An illiterate workforce couldn't have done it. In the 20th century, we had a new convergence of communication energy, a second industrial revolution, centralized electricity, and especially the telephone. Then later, radio and television became the communication media to manage and market a oil-powered, auto-driven suburban culture and a mass consumer society. That second industrial revolution is on life support. The energies are sunsetting, the technologies are old, the infrastructure is crumbling. We are on the cusp, however, of a new convergence of communication energy, a third industrial revolution, and it could get there in time, but we really have to be up to the effort. The internet has been a very powerful communication energy, as you suggest. What's interesting about the internet is the way it's organized. I grew up on centralized electricity, one-to-many, television, radio, and we're the passive audience. The internet is distributed and collaborative, and it scales to lateral power. So now we have 2.3 billion people. This is amazing to me. We did this in 20 years. 2.3 billion people now have a little cell phone or a desktop computer, and they can send their own video, audio, and text, distributed and collaborative, to each other at the same time, at the speed of light, with more lateral power than all the centralized television networks of the 20th century. That's amazing. This internet communication revolution is only half the story of the third industrial revolution. This internet communication now is beginning to merge with a new energy regime, distributed energies that are organized collaboratively and that scale to lateral power. It's a fit. What are distributed energies? Well, I mean, let's compare them to elite energies. Coal, oil, gas, uranium for nuclear power, they're elite because they're not found everywhere. They're not found in your backyard or mine. They're found in a few places. They require huge military and geopolitical investments and massive capital, and they have to scale centralized top-down. Elite energies require elite centralized factories, centralized logistics, centralized supply chains, centralized culture. The distributed energies are energies that are found in every square inch of the planet. The sun shines all over this world every day. The wind blows across the earth 24 hours a day. Everywhere underneath the ground of this planet is a hot geothermal core of energy. In the rural areas, we have agricultural and forestry waste that can be converted quickly to energy. And in the coastal areas, our ocean tides and waves are coming in every day. We can convert it to energy. Wherever there's small hydro, we convert to energy. And wherever there's garbage, it can be anaerobically converted back to energy overnight in your kitchen. We have enough of these distributed renewable energies to provide for our species until kingdom comes. 45 minutes of sunlight can power the world for a year. So the European Union has committed itself to a 5-pillar infrastructure plan for a third industrial revolution. I was privileged to develop the plan for the EU. It was formally endorsed by the EU Parliament in May 2007. It's now working its way through the European Commission departments and agencies and the member states. And I should say Germany is leading in all these 5 pillars. I've advised the Chancellor since she came into office. Germany's way ahead of the game here. All right? And that's something to be watchful for because Germany created the second industrial revolution with the internal combustion engine, Daimler-Benz, and the Autobahn. Good idea, bad government on the Autobahn, but it created it. Pillar 1, the EU is committed to 20% renewable energy by 2020. That's a mandate. France and every country has to get there. It means a third of your electricity has to be green. Pillar 2, how do we collect these distributed renewable energies that we're committed to? Our first thought was, well, let's go to Italy, Greece, and Spain. We love the vacation there. They have a lot of sun. We'll build these big solar parks, concentrate the energy, and put it on a high voltage line and ship it out. The Irish have all that offshore wind, concentrate it, high voltage line, ship it out. The Norwegians have hydro, concentrated, high voltage line, ship it out. Let me say, none of us oppose these more concentrated uses of what are essentially distributed energies. They're essential, they're not sufficient. They're only a small part of the third industrial revolution, and you cannot manage a continental or global economy on centralized renewables. It's not ample enough. And we began to ask a question a few years ago, if renewable energies are found in every square inch of this world, why would we only use them and collect them in a few central points? And it dawned on us, we were using 20th century thinking based on elite energies that are found in a few places, then you have to concentrate it there. So pillar 2, buildings. Buildings use the most energy, they create the most CO2. By the way, the number 2 cause of climate change, I always feel I have to say it because no government leader has yet made a single statement, Number 2, cause of climate change, is beef production and consumption and related animal husbandry. Number 3 is transport. But number 1 is buildings. We have 191 million buildings in the EU. Homes, offices, factories, barns, sheds. The goal is to convert every single potential building in France and Europe to your own green micro power plant. So you can collect solar electricity on the roof, wind off the side of your building for electricity, geothermal heat converted energy with a heat pump under your building, take your garbage and convert it back to energy in your kitchen, etc. The new buildings are actually positive power. And a French company created the critical invention of the Second Industrial Revolution, as important as Steve Jobs creating the desktop computer. And it was Bouygues, the great French construction company. Olivier Bouygues showed me the blueprints 3 years ago. The building's up. You can go visit it. It's near the OECD headquarters in the Paris suburbs. This is a gorgeous office complex that sucks up just enough solar energy to provide all of its own needs, and it has surplus electricity it sells back to the grid. That is the critical invention, like Steve Jobs. Here's the analogy. 1970, we had a few mainframe centralized computers sharing information with each other in the companies because they were very expensive. The companies shared them. Then Steve Jobs, this young guy, comes along and creates the desktop computer. Now 2.3 billion people create their own information. We've democratized information. Now these buildings, today we have a few power and utility companies with centralized power, and we're the passive recipients. But today we have a few million buildings now creating their own energy. In 10 years from now, tens of millions of buildings will collect their own green energy, electricity. In 30 years from now, hundreds of millions of buildings. So just as we went to desktop computers, renewables are following the same cost curve. Solar and wind are getting cheaper and cheaper, just like desktop computers and cell phones. Within 30 years, they'll be so cheap you'll give them away and you'll buy the service. And once the technologies for collecting renewable energies become cheap, everything's free. The sun is free once you have the technology to collect it on your roof. The wind on your wall of your building is free once you have the technology to collect it. The geothermal heat bubbling up under the ground in your building, that's free as long as you have the technology to collect it. Your garbage is yours. You can convert it back to energy. So the second pillar creates the beginnings of a distributed power. And it jumpstarts the economy. The French economy is moribund. Your young people don't have jobs. They're well educated. They don't have a vision for the future. And you cannot grow the French, German, or any economy in the old Second Industrial Revolution because it's collapsing. So Pillar 2 creates millions of jobs. You have to convert every building in France to a micro power plant. Millions of jobs, thousands of SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, 40 years of conversion. Pillar 3 is the toughest pillar, storage. The sun isn't always shining. The wind isn't always blowing when you need the electricity. Water tables can be down because of climate change drought on hydro. These are intermittent energy, so we have to store them or we lose 3 out of 4 kilowatts. So we're committed to all storage technologies, flywheels, batteries, capacitors, water pumping, they're good. But the EU has committed much of its money at the center of the storage network to hydrogen. Why? It's the basic building block of the universe. It's what we're made out of. It's the stuff of the stars. And it can carry other energies. So the way it works is this. If you have a house with a solar panel or a small company and you're collecting green electricity, if you have some surplus you're not using, you take that green electricity and you put it in water, just like high school chemistry experiments. You put the electricity in water and all the hydrogen, H2O, comes out of the water to the side. Put it in a tank. Then when the sun isn't shining, you simply convert that fuel cell hydrogen back to electricity. Small thermodynamic loss. Pillar 4 is where the energy revolution converges with the communication revolution. We use off-the-shelf internet technology. We take the power and transmission electricity grid of France and Europe and the world, and we convert it in the next 25 years to an energy internet. And that's exactly like the internet. So when millions and millions of players in France and their buildings and around Europe are creating their own green electricity on site, storing it in hydrogen like you store media in digital, then if you don't need some of that electricity, your software can direct you to sell it across an energy internet from the Irish Sea to the doorsteps of Russia, just like we create our own information, store it in digital, share it online. Pillar 5 is transport, last pillar. Electric vehicles came out this year, Daimler, Nissan, GM, Toyota. Fuel cell cars, trucks, and bus run on hydrogen come out in 2014 in mass production. We'll be able to plug in our vehicles anywhere in the infrastructure, get green electricity from our buildings, and wherever we travel, power chargers on every street corner, you can plug right in, and you can get green electricity from the grid. But let's say you're working at your desk. Your car's sitting out there plugged into the parking meter. If the price of electricity goes up on the grid, your computer will register that and direct your car to sell your electricity back to the grid. We're already doing this in some places. It's already being done, tested. These 5 pillars together make up a new infrastructure for a new economic paradigm. They're a mega technology platform. Separately, they're simply components. They're meaningless. And unless we phase in all 5 pillars at the same rate and create a 5-pillar infrastructure node, it all collapses. This is where Obama made his mistake. President Obama wanted a green economy. He spent billions of dollars of tax money to get there. But he did siloed projects. So he put money to a battery factory here, a solar panel factory there, never connected, didn't understand you have to bring the internet together with the renewable energies for a nervous system and then create the 5 pillars. So let me use this analogy, last analogy on this. The music companies, they didn't understand when all you young people started cheating. Evidently, you had nothing to do after school but find new software to share music with millions of you. You called it sharing, they called it cheating. Well, the music companies thought it was a joke. Then they became terrified. Then they went out of business. The newspapers did not understand the distributed collaborative power of millions of people sharing their knowledge and information, whether it be on Wikipedia or the blogosphere in social sites. Now the newspapers are going out of business or they're trying to create blogs. So what's happening here is that this is a generational shift. This third industrial revolution is power to the people. It's the democratization of energy using democratized information. It's distributed capitalism. It's actually beyond capitalism and socialism because it requires everyone to be an entrepreneur with energy, but it also requires deep collaboration in physical spaces to share the energy, just like the internet requires everyone to be entrepreneurial, but also to collaborate in deep social spaces. It's a little bit from capitalism, a little bit from socialism, but it's beyond that. And that's the reason our political leaders are having a hard time getting their minds wrapped around this. There's a generational shift politically. Internet generation under the age of 35. You never talk about right and left, socialism and capitalism, who owns the means of production. That's history. That's not even on your radar. It's not part of your vocabulary. Growing up on the internet, and tell me if I'm wrong, you judge institutional behavior by a different political framework. That is, when you look at a government or a political party or a business or an educational institution, you ask, does this institutional behavior, is this institutional behavior centralized, patriarchal, top-down, proprietary and closed, or is this institutional behavior distributed, collaborative, open, transparent, and lateral power? That's a generational shift. Mm-hmm. We're shifting from hierarchical to lateral power. I grew up believing lateral power must be an oxymoron because power has to be top-down. Your generation grows up to believe side by side. Lateral power allows all of us to work together.
Sure, so talking about this generation, we saw WikiLeaks, the Anonymous, now we have pirate political parties, we talked about the internet.
Yeah, Germany, the Berlin elections.
Exactly. We talked about the role of internet in the Arab Revolution. Is it possible to have this parallel lateral power in centralized society, or does the new generation has conflict with the old one?
This has a smell, historical smell to me. It smells a little bit like the French Revolution. No, I'm very serious. Right. Which was really the first real significant revolution of the modern era. The American Revolution too, but the French Revolution, it shares similarities with the Revolution of 1848, which started here in Paris and spread across Europe. It's similar to the revolution on the streets in 1968 in Paris and in New York and San Francisco. And in each case, a generation was emerging with a great economic shift. And what they were saying is we no longer will tolerate arbitrary power, concentrated power, whether it's political or economic. We wanted to bring democracy to the world. And each of those revolutions had long-term impacts. What happened in the Arab Spring in Cairo and Tunisia is a young generation used the lateral power of this third industrial revolution to organize logistically, and they toppled these arbitrary regimes. Just as young people used this lateral power to topple the music companies and centralize news information. So what we're seeing is whether it's, and we see this in the Occupy movement, the October 15th movement that was very big here in Europe and then spread to America. Young people took to the streets and they said, we can no longer tolerate 1% versus 99%. And the young people are without hope. They're educated. They don't see a future. They live in a world that's deteriorating. They're worried about climate change and its impact on their children and grandchildren, and even whether they want to have families. And they're looking for a new vision. They have shown, the Occupy movement is very interesting because they talk about the 1% and the 99%, but they need to understand why that happened. The reason we have 1% and 99% is this. The way a communication energy revolution come together determine the way power is distributed, literally and figuratively. So in the first and second industrial revolution, we had elite energies. They had to be organized centrally, and you had to vertically scale them with centralized factories, centralized supply chains, centralized logistics, centralized distribution, and centralized communication electricity. That's how they scaled. But what happened in the first and second industrial revolution is it created a pyramid. And let me say, those at the bottom of the pyramid did benefit. Now, we are certainly, many of us, let me say this, those of us in the developed world, even at near the bottom of the pyramid, we benefited. We're better off today at the end of the second industrial revolution than our ancestors were before the first industrial revolution. But those on the very bottom, in the colonized parts of the world, they were so marginalized they didn't benefit. And remember, even at the end of the second industrial revolution, the best we could do is provide electricity for half the human race. Today, as I talk with you, 23% of the human race, 24% has never had electricity, and another 25% of the human race has sporadic, infrequent, and not dependable electricity. That's the best we could do with the elite centralized communication energies of this first and second industrial revolution. And so the pyramid that creates means those on top who can control the communication energy matrix on that pyramid benefit disproportionately as you go down the ladder. Those on the upper ladder are the 1%. So today, at the end of the second industrial revolution, 3 of the 5 largest companies in the world are oil companies, and that doesn't include state companies. These are publicly shared companies. Underneath that, banks and financial institutions that help manage the tremendous cost of moving this centralized infrastructure. And under that are 500 companies that together represent a vast part of the GDP of the world. I think 30% of the GDP of the world. May be wrong, and that's about 30%. So what we have to do is realize this just happened. It was the nature of the communication energy matrix. But this shift to a third industrial revolution is power to the people. It's distributed capitalism. It is a vast change in not only the business landscape, but the social and political landscape. So I think whether it's the young occupiers, the October 15th movement, the Arab Spring, what we're seeing here is the beginning of a generational shift. And I think the third industrial revolution is the model for the 21st century and the young people that are coming of age today, for sure.
You talked about tasted solution. Now numerous experiments with smart cities are taking place across the globe. So there is Mazda, Incheon, London, and closer to us, Issy-les-Moulineaux. My first question is, which of these smart cities do you think the most promising? And my second question is, are these experiments only techno-marketing, or do they confront the real problem?
Yeah, that's a good question. No one's asked that before. Let me say that rather than concentrate on the individual experiments, let me concentrate on Germany. As Germany is moving in all 5 pillars and creating the nodal infrastructure for this, not just experiments. Pillar 1, Germany announced in August, they're now at 20% green electricity right now. and they're heading to 35% green electricity by 2020. Where's France? Pillar 2, and this will surprise people, Germany has converted 1 million buildings to green micro power plants. Did folks hear that? 1 million buildings with solar panels or wind or geothermal heat pumps in the last 7 years. How many jobs did they create? In the renewable energy industry, they created 250,000 jobs with their feed-in tariffs. That's net jobs. That represents only 10% of the energy mix, but it's the same amount of jobs in the entire energy industry put together. In other words, that 250,000 jobs is equal to all the other jobs in the mature industries, nuclear, coal, gas, all of it, and it's only 10% of the energy mix. Pillar 3, Germany is now testing hydrogen infrastructure. Pillar 4, they're actually testing the energy internet in 6 regions of Germany right now. Pillar 5, Daimler, who invented the internal combustion engine, they had their 125th anniversary in September, and the day before the Frankfurt Auto Fair, their chairman, Mr. Zesek, introduced their hydrogen fuel cell car to 450 guests from around the world. It gets 750 kilometers before a fill-up, and the only exhaust is water and heat. You can drink the water off the exhaust. I wouldn't recommend it. I gave a narration. If you look on YouTube, there's a 4 or 5 minute narration he asked me to do, and he said, this is the CEO of the company that created the internal combustion engine. We're heading to a third industrial revolution. And they have set up a deal with several companies, Linde AG, Dutch Shell, Vettel, and RWE, the utility company, and they're setting up hydrogen fueling stations across Berlin. So Germany is moving on all 5 pillars. Germany is the most robust industrial economy per capita in the world. And it's the leading exporting power with China, and there's only 80 million people there. So where is France here? What I mean is that the French economy has all of what it needs. You have more ample renewable energies than Germany. You have a tremendous entrepreneurial tradition here. Your SMEs can compete with any SMEs in the high-tech industries of the world. You've got all of what you need. And you should be joining Germany as a co-partner. You created the European Union together. You should be joining France as a co-partner to move this flagship of Third Industrial Revolution forward. I think what's stopping is the centralized thinking of France, if I may be blunt about this. You have a society which did very well in the First and Second Industrial Revolution because centralized thinking was absolutely what you needed to scale energies and production and distribution that had to be centralized. But it doesn't fit an internet renewable energy world. So what has to happen is there has to be a reimagining of the French mentality. You have the intellectual capabilities, the technical capabilities, the economic capabilities, the renewable energies, but now you need a generational shift so you can begin to move your educational system to distributed collaborative education, move your business model to distributed collateral businesses, let the SMEs flourish, move your political parties to a more distributed lateral model so the young people can participate. Rethink France. That's the revolution. And that revolution will follow through the world because the French political tradition and intellectual tradition is unmatched. You created the political idea of the sovereign individual in your French Revolution. And so you also created the European Union. This is very interesting because it was Jean Monnet and it was the early leaders in post-World War II that said no more wars. And you joined with Germany to share energy, the coal and steel community. They didn't want to fight any more wars in the Ruhr Valley. So you joined together, and that started the European Union. And the French intellectual and political people envisioned a continental union to engage a continental market. Now, you wanted a more federal, centralized governance. The Brits wanted a free market. You both lost. You got Network Europe. Europe isn't a union. It's a continental market, and it's politically organized more like a network governance where nobody dominates. Europe now has a golden goose. Everyone's asking me, what's the next stage of Europe? I've met with heads of state here for the last 3 months across Europe. And yes, austerity. But France is discussing austerity. They're discussing fiscal reforms, re-regulating the market, all of that. That's essential, but it isn't sufficient. Number one, you need austerity. But if it's only austerity, you're doomed. Because the financial markets will say to you, we want austerity. Show me you can cut the government to GDP deficit, and then we'll give you better credit. Then you do that, and they say, wait, now you have no growth plan. You've cut everything, there's no growth plan. We still don't trust you. Austerity has to come in, but the perimeter should be the following, these principles. Austerity means, number one, do not undermine the European dream of quality of life. That's your future. Number two, do not compromise the social market model. That's the mechanism to guarantee you a better future. Number three, make sure no one in France is left behind on the net. And number four, any plan you have, it must make sure that it's sustainable development that's commensurate with the environment and the earth and the biosphere we live in. Then you can make cuts. There's lots of cuts after these principles you can make for austerity. But let's say you do austerity. You make fiscal reforms. You reform the labor market. All of that's essential, but if you're living in a second industrial revolution based on mature energies that are more expensive, that are inducing climate change, with old technologies and infrastructure, tell me how you're going to grow the economy. It can't be done. The Germans have realized they have to make a thoughtful transition from an old second industrial revolution on life support. They don't want it to collapse. They want to move from that old second industrial revolution on life support, and they want to give birth to a new baby, a third industrial revolution that can create the prosperity in a sustainable way for the 21st century. Where this fits in for France is interesting. I mentioned France came up with the idea of a continental political union and a market. Everyone's been asking me, how do we ensure that the Europe moves to the next stage of development and doesn't implode? How do we make sure we don't lose the euro and the Eurozone? We don't want to go back to the bad old days. What I'm saying is you have a golden goose. And the French provided this more than 50 years ago. You have 500 million consumers today in this vast continental market. And you have 500 million additional consumers in your partnership regions in the Mediterranean and North Africa. Altogether, 1 billion people. What needs to be done now is you have to introduce the third industrial revolution in every city, every village, every suburb in Europe and the periphery, so you create these 5 pillar nodes everywhere. And these 5 pillar nodes, as they phase in every city, every suburb, every rural hamlet, they phase in like Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi went neighborhood to neighborhood, garage to garage, house to house, 10 years, connected continents. The third industrial revolution scales differently. The first and second industrial revolution, because they were centralized in elite energies, you had national states and national markets. The third industrial revolution nodes want to move uninhibited until they cross all the land to ocean edges. They like to run across land like Wi-Fi. So if you create a node here in Paris or Marseille, 5-pillar node, third industrial revolution, you immediately want to connect with Stockholm or Warsaw. So when you have an energy surplus, good weather, good sun, winds blowing, good water, you want to share your electricity with them. When you have a deficit because of your climate conditions, and maybe Stockholm or Warsaw has a surplus, they want to share it back with you. Creating this third industrial revolution nodal infrastructure connects Europe. You become connected at the hip. You become so connected that you realize you all have some self-sufficiency, but you're all collaborating in deep physical spaces like you do in social spaces on the internet. So here's the golden goose, the next stage of integration. Create a nodal third industrial revolution infrastructure across Europe and in the partnership regions. And then you will have a seamless energy internet, sharing energy, and a seamless integrated communication and transport grid, and a seamless infrastructure so 1 billion people can engage in commerce and trade in a post-carbon society that can move us to a sustainable world. And then that's the next stage of globalization. Globalization from the top down never worked. The young people were right. Because with centralized energies in production and logistics, you couldn't actually globalize the whole world top down. The third industrial revolution, because it's bottom, 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 neighborhood to neighborhood, business to business, city to city, it likes to create lateral power, which favors continentalization as the way to create globalization. Continental markets, continental political unions. Now, the French came up with this idea and started the common market, then the EU. The French are still the intellectual leaders in the political philosophy. They got to join with Germany now, which is the economic engine. These countries have got to join together and finish the European project the French started. That's a third industrial revolution. And you have to wean yourself off of 20th century technologies, even nuclear power. That's 20th century. I don't think 3 generations growing up on the internet in 2050 that are used to distributed democratization of information are going to be surrounded by old-fashioned, clanky, centralized nuclear power plants. Do you? No. Let's get on with it.
May you be massively heard.
Do one more
here
question,
in
then I
France.
have to go, or two. I'm really,
One more.
Yeah.
Okay, so we selected a web surfer question.
Yeah.
Nathalie is asking, Jeremy Rifkin, you advise opinion makers. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the years to come?
I'm neither. I've been a social activist for too long, about 45 years. Our first protest we organized was the 200th anniversary of the Boston Tea Party, which you probably heard of. It was the Boston Tea Party was a famous event, started the American Revolution. On the 200th anniversary, we were right in the middle of the first OPEC oil embargo, and oil prices were shooting through the roof. And we couldn't, people were lining up at gas stations, couldn't get gas. In America, mobility in the car is like freedom of press, speech, and assembly. We don't tolerate not having car mobility. So everybody was upset, and we organized the first demonstration in history against the oil giants and OPEC. And 20,000 people, whole families, young people, came out on a blizzard on the docks, the wharf of Boston on the 200th anniversary of that Tea Party, and we threw empty oil barrels into the Boston Harbor, and that began the first protest against these energies. We're now almost a half a century later. It's time for a younger generation to pick up the mantle and begin moving this. Now, I'm not optimistic or pessimistic. As a social activist, that does me no good. If I'm an optimist, I'm always waiting around for a better tomorrow, passively. If I'm a pessimist, I'm always thinking it's always going to be bad, so why try? I'm always guardedly hopeful, but I'm not naive. I understand that these shifts take generations. They require discipline, imagination, and willpower, and patience, and mindfulness, and maturity. It requires 3 generations, you, your children, and grandchildren, to bring this new paradigm online. It requires that we be mature in our thinking, steadfast in our resolve. It also requires that we shift consciousness. This is part of a 2-book series. The first book I wrote last year was The Empathic Civilization, and that was saying we have to have a new rethinking of the narrative of history. Yes. And that's based on our empathic sensibilities, not our utilitarian sensibilities. The second book was then, how do you take theory to practice, this third industrial revolution? If we don't shift consciousness quickly, this third industrial revolution will not happen. It's a good game plan. There's no plan B. These 5 pillars are common sense. If there's some other plan to change the world, to get us to where we have to go, step forward. I haven't heard it. It's just common sense. But even with a good and deliverable game plan, we have to change consciousness. We have to move from geopolitical thinking to biosphere consciousness. It's happening. Go into France, any school in France, 10-year-old kids are coming home. And they're saying to their parents, why is the television mode on when no one's watching it? Why do we have 2 cars when we can do car sharing with a smart card when we need the car? Where did my clothes, where were they grown? How did it impact the environment? Or let me take a classic example. I'm going to step on some toes here. Where did the meat on my table come from? French love their charcoal beef. So a young kid might come home and say, did my hamburger or my steak, did it come from the central rainforest somewhere? Did they have to destroy the trees in a rainforest to have a soil to graze cattle? And when they did that, what happened to all the animal life that lived in those tree canopies? Did they go extinct? And when they destroyed the trees for the soil to graze the cattle for my steak, did that mean there was no CO2 sink to absorb the carbon dioxide from industrial emissions? And that means the temperature of the earth went up because the trees weren't absorbing the CO2 from industrial emissions. That means some farmer 10,000 miles away from that central rainforest, he's getting floods and droughts on his land, and he can't grow food for his kids. The kids are systemically thinking systemically. They're beginning to realize that every single thing we do has an ecological footprint that affects the well-being of some other creature or some other human being or some other species somewhere on the planet. That change has happened in less than 8 years. It's the beginning of Biosphere Consciousness. We're beginning to realize that we are communities within communities. We're not just our extended family. We're not just our religious community. We're not just our political jurisdiction. We are in a broader, indivisible community, and that is the biosphere we all dwell in. The biosphere is the sheath from the stratosphere to the ocean depths, where geochemical processes interact with life to maintain the stability of this planet. That's the individual biosphere. And a younger generation growing up on the internet is now beginning to annihilate time and space, and they see each other as brothers and sisters on Facebook. If a young person is injured in the Arab Spring and their Facebook picture is up there and they have a YouTube video of their being harmed, every other young person in the world is there immediately empathizing with them as extended family. When we began to share energy, it deepens our interdependence. We began to realize we're all indebted to each other. We share the energy of the planet. We steward it together to maintain the functioning of the biosphere, not just for us, but for our fellow creatures. They've got a right to be here, even if we're not. So we have to see ourselves as partners. So the third industrial revolution brings us together in virtual space and in real space. We become one extended family on the social spaces of the internet and one extended family in the physical spaces that make up the third industrial revolution nodes across continents. That's a big leap forward. I am confident that the young people in France will play a leadership role in moving this third industrial revolution. I have no doubt about it. I think they've waited too long. They're hungry to have this change. They're intellectually and emotionally ready for this. I believe the young people in France are ready to lead this revolution, to join with their young peers in Germany and across the world, and begin to move us to a sustainable third industrial revolution society. They've got the intellectual capabilities, the technical know-how, and I think they have the passion and commitment to do it. It's time now for a change of guard. It's time for a younger generation to step forward, open the door, and move us from vertical to lateral power across France.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
If we go across this feeling of impotence that we have sometimes, because for young generation, we hear all the time that the situation is dramatic and that we have to do something very quickly. But in the same times, we have the feeling that nothing moves from the States.
You got to watch attention deficit disorder, because on the internet it's very facile and it's very easy to jump from one thing to another and desensitize. While it connects the whole world, it can also be desensitizing, or it can shorten the attention span. The third industrial revolution requires long-term planning. It requires a generation that doesn't have ADHD. It requires a generation that can be mindful, can be systemic in its thinking, can reflect and project, and be willing to honor past commitments and future obligations. So what we have to do is use the internet and renewable energy. When they converge together, we have to use this opportunity of this third industrial revolution to create biosphere consciousness. What that means, biosphere consciousness means we're mindful of our obligations to the past and our obligations to the future, and we learn to live in this biosphere so that we are good partners and we don't produce and consume faster than nature can recycle and replenish. That sense of mindfulness, where we look at our relation to the planet over long periods of history, is what's required. My only reservation, and I'm saying this, for a younger generation, is you've got to find a way not to jeopardize mindfulness and attention span. You've got to be able to think systemically, and you have to be determined to think long term. Otherwise, you will not get to a sustainable world, and our species will really be threatened with its future prospects on this planet. So I think this is a decisive moment. I'm guardedly hopeful the younger generation can do this. I think you're in a long tradition of France. It started with the French Revolution, the Revolution of 1848, and the revolution on the streets of Paris in 1968. It's your turn now, 21st century.
Okay.
Cette émission exceptionnelle est maintenant terminée. Merci à tous de l'avoir suivi. Merci à Jérémy Rifkin, aux éditions Les Liens qui libèrent, et à Anne Vaudoyer, sans qui cette émission n'aurait pas eu lieu. Merci à Nils Aziosmanoff, Salomé Kiner de nabu.com. Merci à la JD Carré pour avoir réalisé cette émission exceptionnelle encore une fois. Merci à Triple C et à ses traducteurs. Merci à nos partenaires médias, nabu.com, Soun, Arte Créative, écoloinfo.com. Merci à notre parrain Joël de Ronet. Je crois n'oublier personne, non. Alors nous vous donnons rendez-vous le 28 février prochain pour un nouveau Rendez-vous du Futur qui sera cette fois-ci en direct et cette fois-ci également au Cube à Issy-les-Moulineaux. Il aura lieu avec Axel Kahn. Vous pourrez dialoguer avec lui. Vous pouvez d'ores et déjà lui poser vos questions sur le site, sur Facebook, sur Twitter au 28 février.